Thank you again for joining today's session, Navigating Your Career in a Virtual World, the State of the Global Economy. My name is Nicole Green, and it's my pleasure to serve you all as the Alumni Engagement Manager. To start our session today, I do want to acknowledge that we have a great series that we're kicking off. So this is session 1. We hope that you are able to join us for the additional sessions that are going to be coming up. Our next one will be in March. And these links and this presentation will be shared with you. So you're more than welcome to register for the entire series. I would also like to mention that this session is being recorded and it will be shared out in our communications once the recording is edited and processed and available. In addition to that, we also will have some event photography taking place. And if you are not comfortable with your camera being on, feel free to turn that off. But we're going to be taking some photos. We want to make sure we capture some great moments that we may have during today's session. In addition to that, I think I just mentioned that, but our presentation slides that you'll see today will be shared out in our post-event email. And so be on the lookout for that. There are some active links in this presentation that you can click on and it'll take you directly to the information that will be shared today. And without further ado, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Jason Stubers, who will welcome you officially today, as well as introduce our speakers.
Thank you so very much, Nicole. Again, my name is Jason Stubers. I am the Associate Director for Alumni Engagement and also an alum 2014 of the MSOD program, which is the Master of Science in Organization Development. I would like to officially welcome you to today's Career Track Series 2, Session 1. And if you would like to networking with one another post this event, my colleague Nicole Green will be dropping in the networking forum into the chat. So please do take a look at that and add your name to that if you would like to keep in touch with those in attendance today. At this time, I would like to officially welcome today's speakers. So next slide. So our two speakers today are Dr. David Smith. He's a professor of economics and the associate provost for online programs at the Pepperdine Graziadio Business School, and also Professor Dr. Brandon Parsons, who is practitioner instructor of economics at the Pepperdine Graziadio Business School. So at this I'd like to officially turn it over to Dr. David Smith and Dr. Brandon Parsons for on the state of the global economy.
Well, thank you, Jason. And I think I know Brandon and I are pleased to be back here for this session, an opportunity to share with you some of our insights about where we're headed and the implications for those in attendance. And I think we've got some good stuff to share today. Brandon, I'm going to kick it over to you when you're ready to go ahead and get us started on our presentation.
Excellent. Thank you, Dave. So just a high-level overview first before we get started. So what we're going to do today is really look at what's happening with the current recovery. And then Dave's going to look at some situational analysis, specifically, looking at herd immunity kind of trends and situations. I'll take a look at some specifically industries that we're looking at growth now and in the future. And then Dave will wrap up looking more specifically at labor markets in the Los Angeles area. So first things first, what I'd like to do is just share a quick story on where we've been, where we're to the point of where we're going. What does it look like? And the way to start is just looking at gross domestic product, which is why is it an important metric? Because real GDP is really showing the amount of goods and services being produced, and it correlates to the quality of life since population keeps going up year over year. And what we've seen all the way up to 2020 is quarter over quarter growth of 1 to 3%. Okay, and then the second quarter hits and we had this unprecedented drop in gross domestic product, around 33% drop. Why was this the case? Well, we saw consumer spending drop. We're going to get into why we saw a large drop, but there was consumer spending as well as supply side dynamics where businesses actually had to shut down. And this, that was a quarter over quarter basis. When we look at, year over year, what we're seeing is it was a 4% drop in 2020, looking at the year as a whole. And projections for 2021 are looking at about 3% increase. What's important to note here is we're still not going to get back to pre-pandemic levels in 2020. As we dropped 4% in 2020, we're growing 3% in 2021. We're still not reaching that 2019 level. So we're still going to be in this recovery phase, and we still won't get back to what our economy was probably until 2022. And looking specifically at the recovery and what we're seeing, and this is called the reverse square root. And what we've seen is obviously back in March, April, we saw this huge drop in GDP. And subsequently, we've seen improvements. We've seen some recovery. Why have we seen some of this recovery? Well, we've seen monetary and fiscal stimulus take place. We've seen some improvements in consumer spending that have taken place, but we haven't gotten back to this pre-pandemic level. And why we're continuing to see, this pre-pandemic levels is really looking at the dynamics of the economy. This chart is looking specifically at small businesses. The percentage of small businesses that are open. And we're continuing to see, this is of January 2027 of this year, 33% of small businesses still are not open, or maybe they will not ever open again, right? Continuing to drag down the economy. And if we go back and look at the shape here, well, this shape resembles what I was talking about as it relates to the current recovery. It looks at like this square, this reverse square root. These shapes are similar because small businesses are an important driver of gross domestic product in an economy. Well, there's, what's leading to these small businesses being shut down or not open? Well, it's multifaceted. We have consumers not spending as they normally would, right? We have constraints on small businesses as it relates to how many people they can have in their store. Regulations that kind of limit their ability to profit. And these are all leading to these outcomes of lower gross domestic product, lower growth, and a kind of a bit of a stalled recovery that we're seeing here, this kind of continuation. We do have some good news here recently where we do see an uptick in consumer spending. But why we focus on consumer spending so much is that's one of the biggest drivers of gross domestic product. In the United States, about 70% of consumption, of spending the goods and services that take place, comes from consumer spending. A lot of it's discretionary. And when consumers get spooked, when they have concerns about the economy, they will stop spending, and it leads to these outcomes. Another driver that I wanted to take a look at, this is getting more into segmented look into what's going on. Well, when we look at the labor based on skill level, and really broken down here by wage, we're seeing different outcomes. And what's of note here, obviously we've continued to follow the same trend, and we still continue to see this reverse square root shape. because this is the driver of the economy, is those that are working in low wage, which tends to correlate a lot of times with low skilled labor, have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. So we see here 20%, 21% drop. And why? These jobs are more consumer exposed, meaning that they're interacting with consumers more. Whereas high wage employment, they're more likely to be able to work from home. High skilled employment, they're more likely to be able to work from home, which is allowing them to retain their job. And it leads to one of these outcomes that we're seeing. And we hear this in the news, we see this, it's called the K-shaped recovery. Meaning the recovery has really led to two different outcomes. And we can think about this as it relates to specific industries, but also when we look at different labor categories. Where if we look at just industries, the tech firms have done well, done better. More and more consumers are utilizing Amazon in their deliveries, are utilizing cloud-based technology. They're using big tech more and more. We're seeing an increase in demand, right? And these firms that are, again, more exposed, food service, hospitality, well, they're having, a drop in demand. These firms are laying off employees more and more. So there's also this scenario, this dynamic that's taking place when we look at skilled and unskilled labor. Skilled labor are better able to continue to work from home. And we actually may see cases where their income is going up and their expenses are going down. Versus unskilled labor, well, they're more likely to be laid off or become unemployed. And their expenses aren't necessarily going down because they might have to find daycare. The schools are out. Their expenses actually might be going up. So we're seeing this bifurcated outcome when we look at the different segments, both industry as well as skill as it relates to labor. All right, so let me pass it off to Dave now to do some situational analysis.
Thank you, Brandon. And I do think your just last point, just commenting on that, just points out why some of the aid that's being kicked around in Congress, it is better off if it's targeted and doesn't necessarily go to those who need it the most. It goes to those who need it, who do need it the most. Anyway, yeah, so I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And what we're going to do here is do some audience participation. So this is an audience poll. I'm going to drop in the chat a link. The easiest way to respond to this, you can use text, but you can also go to this website here to do some quick, you have to put in your name, but we don't collect any of the data. You don't have to log in or anything. But I want you to go here and give me your thought about when do you think the U.S. will reach herd immunity for COVID-19? All right, so there we go. We got a response. Excellent. You can also use the text feature on your phone if you'd like. And herd immunity is different definitions, but the CDC, it says maybe between 60 to 75% of the population either has the vaccine or is immune to COVID, perhaps because they received it before. So we've got some, got 21 responses in so far. I'll wait a little bit while some come in, but while they do come in, and it looks like it's maybe a realistic or a pessimistic group, Brandon. But what I would say is that what's really important is we kind of look to the future. I mean, Brandon's done a nice job of kind of covering where we're at and where we've been, but it really depends. I mean, who would have thought I think it was almost 11 months ago today that Pepperdine announced, it was shutting down its residential campus, and it was going online. Of course, many other universities were doing that out there, and thank you, Samuel. I'll see if I can address that. Looks like we've gotten 28 responses. That's pretty good. I will go to the next question in a second. But it really depends. And I wouldn't have guessed that 11 months ago we'd still be in a state of uncertainty. We know a lot more than we did then. And I think we do have a sense of the road ahead, but it would really have been hard to predict a lot of the outcomes, or there was a lot of uncertainty around it. And so we have to keep that in mind as we look forward, is that we're trying to give an outlook with some sort of confidence or some sort of kind of reasonable parameters. So I'm going to move on there. It looks like about 75% of you believed that was realistic. And I'm going to try to see if I can move on to the next question here. And the next question is a question for you personally as you think about the pandemic on your organization's finances. Where has it been negative, very negative, somewhat negative, neutral, somewhat positive, or very positive? As you think about your organization, what do you see happening? So we've got about 7 responses. I'm sorry if the text isn't working. I guess we're going to have to rely on the online polls. Looks like to me we got a spectrum here, and it's kind of consistent, perhaps, with what Brandon showed from his data, is that some very hard hit places, some doing well, and so that's very interesting to me. Looks like on balance, though, it's been hard on organizations, from a financial perspective, and perhaps if you're not in the technology sector specifically, I mean, even in the healthcare sector has been hit pretty hard because I remember the first GDP numbers came out said they were the hardest hit industry because they couldn't do elective procedures and the things that they rely on for income over time. So nice work there. I've got 26 responses there. That's some good data in terms of our audience and what we've seen from the pandemic. One more audience feedback. This one's a little bit different. Let's see here. I'm going to try to get to the next slide. And for some reason I have to exit here. So this one will only work with the web base. It wouldn't work with text anyways. But thinking about your own personal professional outlook for 2021, what would be one word to describe it? So, okay, there we go. We're going to get a little Wordle here. We've gotten gotten about 5 responses so far. Hopeful is we've got an optimistic group. That's good. Pepperdine Wave spirit there, taking an early lead. But let's be honest. Let's make sure we're honest. Economists, it is the dismal science, Brandon. So if this was a group of economists, we could imagine what sort of words we'd be getting, right? But this isn't a group of economists. So there you go. We've got uncertain, and that certainly, I think I would agree with that. We've got hopeful and positive, optimistic, and maybe for me, I don't know, Brandon, what you would say, but maybe for me it depends on the day. So, but by nature, I do believe I'm an optimist. So I do think at times, and this is actually relevant, that I think at times, and some of the news cycle can do this, but we can trend towards too much pessimism as it relates to what the data is really telling us. And so I think my sense is, and this is just shoot from the hip, and I'm not an epidemiologist or health expert at all, but that I think overall the good news outweighs the bad news right now as it relates to the the underlying situation in the United States and perhaps even the world more generally as it relates to the pandemic. So nice work there. Enjoyed getting all those responses, and I'm going to go ahead and close this out. We will move on, assuming I can do that. I guess I have to deactivate this. Sorry about that. And we will move on to the next slide. So good to get your feedback in terms of where you think we are. I think one, as Brandon and I talked about this presentation today, it's like important to notice that we're looking at very different scenarios. And there are some variables that are going to be really important in kind of informing our analysis. These are kind of some of our basic assumptions as we kind of look at the road ahead. And as qualified experts, economists look at the road ahead. Number one is, when do new COVID cases peak? Well, our best estimate is we've hit that in January. And we're on a downturn, and we're not going to see, we're making an estimate here. We're not going to see the new variants taking off in quarter two. So that's wrong. That changes the outlook. Are there significant lockdowns in the first quarter? The first guess is no. That we know that many states, and California is certainly relatively locked down. But are we going to see more new lockdowns? Our best guess is no. Also, vaccines. When are they going to be broadly available? And I think the best data suggests that in Q2, there was actually even good, I saw a little news snippet from Fauci today on this, noting that he believes there's going to be wide availability in the second quarter. And I believe that's really positive. And we are seeing some positive news in terms of our health system's ability to ramp up, vaccine dosages. So, but it's our best guess. Something could go wrong. Size of the stimulus package, the Democrats have, this is a really key factor. In fact, most economists might even put the most weight on this as it relates to our estimates for what the future will look like. And so I would say that there's going to have to be some compromise. And if we were to guess, I would think maybe a 1.5 trillion will be some sort of compromise that'll get it through fairly quickly. And when does it actually get deployed? We believe it'll begin to be deployed in quarter one, and then also some of it in quarter two and quarter three. And then as Brandon showed some data on consumer spending and labor markets, our best estimate is that there's kind of a slow rising improvement in quarter one, but we will see some quick, sharp upticks in quarter two and quarter three. So these are kind of this is kind of what our best thinking. And like I said, expert economists and macroeconomic forecasters look at when we're looking at the future. If we were to graph this out, this is, whoops, sorry about that. That was my fault. This is from the conference board here. If we looked at the data in terms of where we were back in January 2020, when the first cases were known to have existed in the United States, and we looked at these different scenarios here, you've got the best case up here in orange, you've got the best guess case here in black, and then the blue case would be a worst case scenario, and that would include perhaps a sharp correction in equity markets, possibly, which we don't anticipate, but could happen, or some sort of geopolitical conflict. Those things could certainly make a big difference going forward. But our best guess is that by mid 2021, we could be where we were in January 2020. That's a relatively quick economic recovery, and very uneven though, and of course how it's being. This is courtesy of the conference board. But I think these are good estimates, recognizing there's still a wide amount of uncertainty around what might occur. So I'm going to turn it back over to Brandon.
Great, thank you, Dave. And yeah, I was thinking about I believe they said April. Dr. Fauci said April, just about everybody might be able to get their vaccine, which I believe may put things on the more optimistic view of a recovery. So that was good news. What I want to do now is just do a quick look at some industries that we kind of see as obviously growing now and in the future. And I'll admit some of this is low-hanging fruit that I believe that most of you see, but it's important to also just kind of look at what are the implications of this growth of these industries. And this is no surprise to anybody here, but the continued growth of big tech. And this was interesting. That article came out from the Wall Street Journal showing a 52% growth, market share growth of the big firms, the big tech firms from 2020 to 2021. So we see a 52% growth, market cap growth. And what's really driving that? Well, it's reliance on big tech, especially because of the pandemic. Needing the cloud, needing delivery, web conferencing, computers, being able to connect on, online. Reliance on tech is increasing, which is increasing demand, which is increasing quantity demanded. And these firms have, some protection from entrance, and we're starting to see the government involved. But we should expect this growth to continue as more and more firms continue to probably to work remotely and allow that to continue. There's going to be continued reliance on the services from big tech. So I expect a continuation of growth now and in the future. Another segment is renewable energy. And why I'm pointing this out, there's a few different reasons. One is the new administration and its promotion of green energy, of renewable energy. There's going to be tax incentives for corporation as well as consumers down the road. So when we're looking at even before the new administration, we've seen growth in these renewable energies over non-renewable. And we're going to continue to see this, and we're looking at solar getting bigger and bigger. And when we look at these trends, well, even on a more micro level, we're seeing the cost calculus change. Where there was the big announcements from GM saying they're going all electric by 2035. But recently we read some articles suggesting that right now, those consumers that want to buy an electric vehicle, they have to pay a bit of a premium over gas combustion. Well, that cost calculus is going to change down the road, where it's going to be cheaper for consumers to buy an electric vehicle, or the manufacturer, it will be cheaper for them to produce electric vehicles. Why? Because of the costs are coming down for lithium batteries, the cobalt production. All these drivers are probably going to lead to an increase in the demand for renewable energies now and in the future. Another kind of industry that I expect increases in demand is just looking at the demand for automation and artificial intelligence. And why are we going to see this increase in demand? Well, one of the reasons is just the fact that cash is cheap right now, low cost capital, right? And we're seeing upward pressure on wages, potentially, especially there's been some news on potential increases in the minimum wage. And when wages go up and the cost of capital, the cost of investing in automation and technology go down, we should expect that firms may be looking to automate or to utilize automated technology and artificial intelligence more and more, especially coming right out of the pandemic, where a lot of businesses were disrupted. When we think about the supply side, where firms were disrupted, where they couldn't get labor to produce their goods and services. So they're probably going to be looking at other alternatives, not only just because it makes sense financially, but because of the pandemic driven disruptions. They may need to think about a plan B. So obviously there's others, and we've seen winners and losers, and we've talked about that. But these are ones that I believe we think are really going to see some growth now and into the future. And I'll stop there and pass it back over to Dave to look at the local markets.
we'll go ahead and wrap this up pretty quickly because I know many of you are looking forward, and we're looking forward to the question and answer session. And I just want to make a note too, Brandon. I see a lot of my students on here. I tried to say hello to as many of them as I could, so it's good to see a lot of you. I'm sure you do as well. It's good to see so many of you today. I wish I had the chance to say hello to all of you. So what about, most of us are in California or Los Angeles, and even if you aren't, what happens in California is very important. If it was an economy with $3.2 trillion in economic output, if it was an economy on its own, to be in the top 5 of the world, a larger economy even than India. So what happens in California is important, even if you don't live here. But let's talk a little bit about what's happening here. One thing, and I thought this was a really interesting graph, and just highlights the points about the unevenness of the impact of the pandemic. If we looked at consumer spending year over year, you can see in California it's down about 10%, where in some states it's positive. I mean, in Florida it's positive. In Idaho it's positive, and you can see some of these trends. Remote workers in Idaho, the downturn of the leisure and hospitality business in the state of California. So California has some unique aspect and has been hit harder, and this isn't unusual. California was hit harder in all the prior recessions since I've lived here. It certainly was hit hard 2009, 2010, and then in the early 2001 recession it was more kind of defense industry based. So California is getting hit hard again. And so what's going on here that makes it unique? Well, we know leisure and hospitality is one aspect of that. And if we drill into Los Angeles, consumer spending is down about the same as California, about a little bit more, down about 11%. And as Brandon noticed, consumer spending is what really drives GDP. So we've got some areas of concern that are specific to California. Even as the news is relatively optimistic, we've got some issues, I think, related to the pandemic that make it more severe. And Brandon showed this earlier, the percent of small businesses being closed, more than a third out in Los Angeles. Where are the jobs? So this is a little bit confusing, but this is the percent change in job postings in Los Angeles. So we go back here to January 2020 on the left side of the graph here, but let's jump all the way. And this is how they've changed over the pandemic. But if we go over here, they're all down from where they were in Los Angeles from a little over a year ago. But there are some openings happening in education and health services and manufacturing. All right, so there was actually a question that came in on this. It just happened to be in our presentation. And financial activities, there has been an uptick, a little bit of an uptick. Now this isn't seasonally adjusted data, but these are areas where there are some signs of job openings, okay, in the Los Angeles area. Where are not the jobs, or where aren't the jobs? Professional business services. So just think about the entire infrastructure, for office buildings and a lot of the work that's done in, company buildings. Well, a lot of that is lumped into this professional business services category, and a lot of people are working in a home. So unfortunately those jobs have been really hard hit. I mean, they have to hire laid off labor before they're going to go out and advertise for new positions. And of course, leisure and hospitality has been hit pretty hard as well. No surprise there. That's those are kind of the early signs of where we're starting to see an uptick in employment. And I just want to finish with this slide, and I want to editorialize a little bit from my own perspective as a labor economist. California and Los Angeles are in a little bit of a perilous situation from my own standpoint in terms of being kind of the leading economy in the United States. I mean, if you add the second and third leading economies, states in the United States are Texas and New York, and you almost have to combine their output to equal what California produces. But I think we're at a little bit of an inflection point, and there are some important decisions that have to be made by government authorities and policymakers as to our future. So number one, our unemployment here is ranks 49 out of 51 states, which includes DC. So we're not doing well from an employment standpoint. Once again, not entirely surprising, given the focus on leisure and hospitality, but it's 9% in Los Angeles, and that's a really high number. That's an economy that's still in a deep recession. Now, in addition to that, and I think this is important, and those of you who've had economics before may have remembered this little point, that if a worker gives up and stops looking for work, they aren't considered as in the labor force, and that can actually make the unemployment rate go down just by the way that we actually count unemployment. There is a statistic that isn't widely reported, but it's called U6 unemployment, that counts those that are unemployed looking for work, and then those that are discouraged and have given up looking for work. That number is 17.1% in California and 21.9% in LA. So nearly, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 4 workers in LA has either given up looking for work or wants to work. So that's a significant societal issue. And so what needs to happen here? I think number one, the public policy agencies and the government really needs to revamp job placement and training support to make sure these individuals can be gainfully employed. In addition to that, there's been a lot of migration out of California in the last year. Some of this may be permanent with the remote working arrangements going forward. That is going to really significantly hurt the tax base of California. And I think what I would say here to public policymakers is stop discouraging high wage earners from staying in the state and try to keep them from leaving the state. There are many other states that are already are finding ways to incentivize workers to come live there, whether it's Tennessee, Texas, Florida, and South Carolina. They're openly trying to woo California workers to come work there remotely. And of course, you know the story about Elon Musk going to Texas. So how might that happen? Well, I think there needs to be a discussion about taxation and, and not necessarily increasing taxes further. And perhaps even considering a moratorium on, capping the state income tax, which is 13.3% on high wage earners. All right. So once again, this is Dave Smith editorializing here as a labor economist. Finally, there's not only a problem with migration of workers outside the state, but also of companies. And we know that last year, Oracle and HP have made plans to exit the state of California. Of course, we would never imagine Facebook and Google would leave. But there is a rising tide of companies that are leaving the state because of burdensome regulation. So this is just something that California has to contend with because it's competing against other states. And if a company finds it to their benefit of them and their shareholders to leave the state, then they will consider those options and maybe act upon it. So those are some things that I think the government and policymakers within the state of California really need to think about going forward to make this, to kind of underpin the long run health of the great state of California. All right, well, I think we've run up against our time, so I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Jason, and we're going to enter a question and answer period, I believe.
Yes, great. Thank you, Dr. Smith and Dr. Parsons. We have a few questions that have come into the chat. So if you do have a question, we have about 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes for the Q&A. So if you do have a question that's percolating, please do drop it into the chat and we will try to get as many of the questions answered as possible. So this first question is from Samuel Liberant, and it's to Dr. Parsons. Where does consulting and professional services sit on the graph that you presented?
I presented a few graphs, but I'm assuming you're talking about the K-shaped recovery. I'll assume that.
Yeah, I think it was the first one, I believe.
Okay. So when we look at consulting, I think it really depends on to the extent that business can continue remotely. So if it can be business as usual with consulting remotely, then maybe it's not gonna be as disrupted as much. But if it's more of a in-person scenario, then yeah. But obviously, looking at another angle there, firms might be tightening their belt as it relates to spending, right? So maybe the demand for consulting could decrease, and we've seen this a little bit with advertising too. Maybe they're not going to be advertising as much during the pandemic just because they have some cost cutting pressures. So I see some different variables potentially affecting the consulting market. I don't know, Dave, if you have some other insights there.
No, I think that's good insight, and I do think this is one of those areas that we'll have to kind of wait and see as it relates to kind of remote working. I mean, there is some companies believe it's working great. Some companies say, they believe it's been not working well for their organization. So we'll definitely see some shifts in how people work, but it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over time. The extent to which the percentage of remote workers increases over prior periods.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question is from Keereth Bush. Are there any early industry trends that you are observing in a post-COVID environment, i.e., is there an increase in industry agnostic firms?
Brandon, that must be for you.
I was thinking, I covered some industry trends as it relates to kind of the big tech. It's when we look at the industry trends, it's really pandemic driven right now. And there's a lot of winners and losers. And we kind of looked at the small businesses and we look at airlines, and it's really dependent on how exposed our company's business plans and their bread and butter to the pandemic. So I'm not beyond that. There's changes on a micro level as it relates to industry, and we're really seeing some consumer preference changes that are really driving these trends. And some difficulty is, well, what's short run and what's long run. And that's where I would recommend that you spend some time analyzing. Is this more of a short run, or is this going to be more of a long run? And that can help you kind of predict kind of how it's going to play out when we look at the industries.
Okay, great, thank you. The third question comes from Carlton Helfer. In your opinion, what are the top 3 best places to invest in the stock market based on growth trends?
Carlton, good to see you show up at the webinar, Carlton. We are not going to give investment advice today, but I think you can use, what we, I wouldn't invest in GameStop, but I heard some have done very well in doing that. I've heard that at least in the news. But I think I've always taken the perspective of being kind of a long run investor. I'm a buy and hold type person. I don't know that I have any extra insight that the market has about trends. I mean, we've certainly seen, technology firms benefit very significantly from the pandemic, but does that mean in the next cycle they will? So, I really think, I think it's a complex answer to that question, but you kind of have to take kind of the whole picture of where the economy's headed and make your own judgment about how you want to invest your dollars. Brandon, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree with that. We're seeing some situations in the stock market that go against logic and when we look at the fundamentals of stocks. And Dave mentioned the GameStop as one of them, and it goes back to there's the famous tulip thing in Denmark, and where the fundamentals of a stock, when you look at the earnings per share, get away from, and the stock price just gets out of caliber with what the fundamentals suggest. And I really look for a sustainable competitive advantage. And Dave got to that, right? We buy and hold for firms that are that are protected from entrance or from higher barriers to entry, that it would be more difficult for a firm to enter and take away their lunch, eat their lunch, is the way I like to put it, if that helps.
Great. Okay, so we have time for about 2 more questions. The next question is from Rich Barsumian. Do you see the real estate market continuing to rise, or will that correct when the economy adjusts?
I'll jump in on this one, Brandon. I was just looking at some market data today on real estate, particularly in the state of California. And my sense is that, first of all, I could ask Carlton the question, but if we're talking about, Los Angeles area, Orange County, if that's where the question is addressed, I think I could say that there needs to be, in the end, prices are being driven up by several factors. We know that people are moving to bigger homes. There's lower, and the low interest rates, right, are driving up home prices right now. In the end, though, the price of real estate has to be connected to income levels. And to the extent that that kind of fundamental relationship gets stretched, there is a point at which it can no longer be stretched. In my opinion, and Brandon, I don't know if you can throw in what you believe, is that, in the next 10 years after this bump, because we're not going to see interest rates go down much further, I would say, any further than they have gone. So after this bump, I would expect growth in real estate prices to be modest at best over the next 10 years. There could be even a correction coming, but I wouldn't bet for a correction. But more along the lines that you predict a 1 to 2 that are in line with projected GDP growth, 1 to 2% per year, or that sort of thing. What do you think, Brandon?
No, I would agree with that. When we think of, and this kind of relates back to that K-shaped recovery that we're seeing, one would have, if interest rates wouldn't have dropped and the pandemic-driven recession occurred, one would have maybe even expected that home price might have went down. But we have these other variables in play. Interest rates drop. And then we're also seeing this dynamic of folks wanting more space. And I was reading an article about the home prices in Boise and Pittsburgh, right? Where there's kind of this migration out of the urban areas to get more space, to get some more value. So I see it really localized when we look at it. But I would agree with Dave that there's got to be some elements of a cap when we talk about being the affordability element. Absolutely.
Okay, and we come up to our last question from Joseph Theobald. What kind of jobs, skill sets do you see providing the most value and opportunities for newly minted MBA graduates seeking employment?
Well, I think there's an emphasis among current employers of being able to interpret data and make having a good data analytics tool set. I think that's something that's becoming increasingly important. I do think it's still very important, even in the virtual world, to have good collaboration skills and team skills, and what falls under the umbrella of people skills. Those things are still very important and have been important for an enduring time. But I do think there is more emphasis on some of the more technical skills, just related to some of the more recent job openings. So the more you can do to make sure that you have that vocabulary, that language, and also some of the knowledge in those areas. And of course, we're trying to respond to that at Graziadio with our programming and our courses and the way that we teach our classes as well.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of points. the value of the MBA and having somebody that sees the different components of business, the different functions, is still important. How everything connects and how the variables connect is still very important. So it's not getting any easier, right? And we think of these globalization forces, we're seeing these consumer preference changes, and really being able to decipher what's going on around you. When we think about not only Dave was talking about data, but events such as monetary changes, government change, policy changes. There's still importance managerial to be able to see all the big picture of all these moving pieces that's happening in business. So I see the demand for generalists still very important.
Well, that concludes. Thank you, Dr. Smith and Dr. Persons. This concludes our Q&A portion of today's event. And thank you again for being our esteemed speakers today on the state of the global economy. And at this point, I will turn it over to our Alumni Engagement Manager, Nicole Green, for the next portion of the program.
Thank you so much, Jason. And ditto to that, Dr. Smith and Dr. Parsons, thank you so much for your insight and economic perspective. And, before we head out, I do want to acknowledge, this is our navigating in a virtual world for your career. And so I did want to take a moment and highlight some of our career and professional development resources that are available to you. We do have staff at Graziadio that are committed to helping you and serving you, whether it's through one-on-one career coaching, whether it's through events and case competitions. We have a great job portal to look for jobs, to post jobs. That's called Handshake. And there's also career leaders and opportunities for micro internships. Maybe you are an employer and you need folks on your team, right? Graziadio is a great place to connect and hire fellow Graziadio community folks. So we encourage you to reach out to our career and professional development team and stay connected with them. Also in the slide presentation that will be shared with you is their contact information. So you can email them, you can call them, you can reach out to them. There are some available resources for that team. They're also on LinkedIn, and it's a great, again, opportunity to stay connected. Okay, thank you again to Dr. Smith and Dr. Parsons for your perspective. Thank you again for taking your time to speak and share insight. I encourage you to stay connected with Graziadio. We are on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, all those fun things, as well as Pep Connect. And so we encourage you to stay connected with us. Please feel free to reach out to our office and our team. We are readily available to service you as alum, or we can even point you in the right direction if you're not specifically Graziadio alum. We are here to help you and serve you. And so we hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you again for joining us. We'll see you again soon.